I am on with Bill Wong, who I'm really thrilled took time out of his day to come and speak with me. I would love for you to introduce yourself, and you're recently retired. What were you doing before you retired? And what are you doing now? That's a great question.
I was the former political director for the Assembly Democrats for the last 2.5 cycles, and I've been the senior political advisor to Speaker Rendon ever since 2014,
Okay.
2015, something like that. And then
Okay.
prior to that, I go all the way back to starting in the world of politics as a staffer in 1987.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line there, I served time as a lobbyist and as a chief of staff, and then a general consultant on a variety of things in between.
Awesome. So are you still playing the role of political advisor to the speaker?
No, I'm completely retired.
So let's break down the veil of the Democratic caucus. What does that mean to be the strategic political advisor to the speaker?
So we've got a caucus, and when I got here, was starting to do it, we had, I think, 53. In 2016, we came back up to 55. Basically, we repatriated Almira Suchi and Sharon Cook Silva. The job is basically to grow the caucus and to protect the members of the caucus. So make sure that our incumbents get reelected, and then look for opportunities to win races. Because the more races that you have and the more races that you win, the more Democrats you have to get to 41 or 54.
Right.
Because there are, for example, coastal Democrats who are more conservative on tax policy, but more liberal on environmental policy just because of their geography. And then there are some Democrats that are Central Valley that are more supportive of worker policies than they are of environmental policies. I always use the analogy that by having more Legos in the box, there's more things you can build. So
That's
our goal was to elect as many Democrats as we possibly could. So in 2018, we elected we flipped 5 seats, and that gave us 60. And then Brian Mainshine had decided that the Republican Party had left him, so he became a Democrat. So we had 61. And that was the most Democrats in the state assembly for over 130 years.
Congratulations. That's a huge accomplishment. I think people need to get how significant that is to build a caucus of that size. I think now it's almost like we take it for granted, but you don't start there, right?
Yeah, and outside of it's great that we got 60, 61, but I think that really what people should focus on is what were the accomplishments in that era. We have pay equity, gender pay equity. We're the only state in the nation that has overtime pay for farm workers. We're the first state in the nation to pass $15 minimum wage. We have the toughest gun laws in the nation. We have the toughest anti-tobacco laws in the nation. We're a global leader in environmental protection and animal safety. We have a hugely progressive platform with regard to anti-recidivism. We also made the largest investments into early child education, expanded the earned income tax credit.
I was just to say the Cali ATC. That's right.
I mean, we've done such amazing things because we've got 60 members of the assembly, and then also a supermajority in the Senate and a Democratic governor. So progressive activists and people who are on the left really should appreciate the fact that these numbers are what allow us to do these types of things. Certainly, there's a lot more work to be done, but you can't do it if you only have 41 or 42 votes.
So business isn't stupid. I think it's pretty well acknowledged that in California, it's Dem on Dem races that are the real big races, right? And that's where the most money is spent. And you generally see industry consolidate around a candidate. I caution myself to not make assumptions about the candidate just because they're the ones the industry has consolidated on. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're moderate or pro-corporate or whatever, right? Sometimes it's the fault lines within the caucus that are the challenge politically. From the advocate's perspective, navigating those fault lines, because exactly what you said, somebody might be this way on one issue, completely the opposite on another. It's actually very issue specific, but we need to be clear that corporate America also makes bets on and investments on who they spend their money on because they want to cause the least harm to themselves, right?
I would caution people to put too much weight into the money thing. Yeah, they spend a lot of money. Do they spend it smartly? Not necessarily all the time.
Mm,
And does it necessarily guarantee a legislative outcome or legislative perspective? No, I
yes.
don't necessarily feel that they spend their money smartly a lot of the time. And I think that
Yes.
there are a lot of tools and approaches that allow advocates to actually win these types of issues without worrying about the impact of money
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah. I think you're totally right. I feel like I get the essence of look who funds the candidates. I think that's inherently true, right? Like, where is money coming from? There always needs to be consideration, but that doesn't mean we as advocates should draw conclusions that someone is someone you can never work with or that they must be a stooge or whatever, right? Politics is the art of what's possible and weaving a thread into a needle. And it's almost like, is that lazy? Probably to look at it that way, because then you just give up and you don't even try. So
Yeah,
that's really
I think that
good.
that's one of the reasons why people get kind of sucked into that rabbit hole is that there's frustration. Yeah, obviously it's not easy and it's hard when you're invested in an issue and you're not winning the issue to connect things of why things happen, but it's not really productive. And focusing on it really blinds you to the opportunities that you do have to turn a member on an issue.
That's right. And unless you've tried everything and you've thrown the kitchen sink at it, you don't know that that is not possible rather than just making a damn conclusion. You're totally right about that. What would you say to a group that's like, we want to get involved in electoral, that hasn't been our lane. We focus, we're one issue. This is a world that's just, we don't know.
They have to go out there and organize. And there are a lot more resources now than there have ever been with regard to being able to learn how to organize and opportunities. You could always volunteer with labor unions, you can volunteer with Democratic Party organizations, progressive organizations, pro choice organizations. There's just so many different
Right,
organizations. But
right.
it's a change in mindset. It's basically trying to understand that. And part of it is because the way we are set up now digitally, everybody is into kind of performative politics. Like they want to go
Mm,
to a rally. A rally doesn't mean anything. It's
mm,
probably the least effective means of advocacy in the sense that it's a one day thing and people
yeah,
just see you come and go.
yeah.
It's more important for you to knock 100 doors than to
Mm,
get 100 people to show up to the steps of the Capitol, because you've seen it. I mean, the people show up to the Capitol, staffers and then members walk in and walk out, and they just totally ignore you because
yeah.
they don't know that whether or not the people there are from the district or whether or
Mm-hmm.
not they've been manufactured somewhere. And also,
Mm-hmm.
like organizations can be manufactured. Like I see a lot of advocacy letters that have these organizational names that make
Yeah.
no sense
Yeah.
to me whatsoever. For example, in some areas
Yeah.
a church leader may be the most impactful person because
Yeah.
that church leader's congregation could be 300, and those
Mm,
are 300 voters.
that's exactly
Whereas
right.
somebody who's like create some phony or at least some performative organization online with a
Mm,
website and no members, even though
yeah.
you have the
Yeah.
right messaging, it doesn't
Yeah.
mean anything to these members.
Yes. And it's the connection to the voters, and that's what counts. What are some basic factors or data points people should look at when they're vetting candidates to even know, is this a pipe dream or this person has a real shot?
It's complex alchemy in a lot of ways.
Mm,
And I think that if you talk to people who say that they absolutely know, they're lying. So you're never going to get to the point where you know for sure whether or not they're
mm,
viable or not viable. But
mm-hmm.
there are different indicators like can they raise money? And it's not like boatloads of money, but when you look at a race for an assembly race or a Senate race, if they haven't been able to raise like 250,000 dollars, it's highly unlikely they're going to be able to communicate with all the voters in the race. But
Mm,
there are exceptions. For example, Alex Lee only raised 30 some $1,000s, but he had a very crowded primary. There were a lot of candidates there. He had like an advantage of having a very common name,
yeah.
and there wasn't a lot of money in play in that race.
Mm-hmm.
So, no disrespect to Assemblymember Lee, but all the right things came forward to help him get there. Now, in his last primary election, is not the same case. He had to raise a lot of money because he was under attack by the realtors and
Yeah.
other interests. So he had to run a more conventional campaign and actually communicate with voters. But there are times when somebody who you might not think is viable is viable. It just really depends upon the circumstances of that race, like how many
Mm-hmm.
candidates are running,
Mm-hmm.
what the current environment is. For example, Tasha Burner Horvath in 2018, AD 76 was represented by Rocky Chavez. He decided
Mm,
to run for US Senate, I think it was.
mm-hmm.
And that seat had never been represented by a Democrat ever. But what had happened was that there were 7 Republican candidates
Mm.
and only 2 Democratic candidates. So there was an opportunity there
I
to
think we
lock
just
out.
saw that in
We just saw that
SD4.
in the Senate, right? Yeah.
Right.
So there are times when candidates who technically would not be viable in other circumstances become highly viable.
That's right. I feel like we've seen those surprise candidacies come through. Another one I'm thinking is Melissa Hurtado when she was first elected. That was not an obvious, right? It was in a Republican incumbent in a heavily Republican district, and she flipped it. It's possible. I think what you're saying is even if all the indicators aren't flashing red light, it's possible. And I guess that goes back to the art of it, right?
Right. And you also have to look at, for like the example, there's so much more depth into a race, and it can be interesting for people interested. But like the Hurtado race, keep in mind that we're also running concurrently a huge turnout campaign for Rudy Salas in that same overlapping assembly district. And at the
Oh,
same time, there was an overlapping DCCC presence for TJ Cox for the congressional seat. So with all of that force multiplier in that district, it really helped lift up all
very
the
good
turnout
point.
that helped Hurtado win.
Very good point.
I think one of the
Yeah.
things that is important for your audience to also know is that I always get the sense that from the advocate community that they feel like they don't want to get involved in politics, not necessarily because it's complicated, but because some of them feel that getting involved in the politics and the campaign side of it breaches the purity of their advocacy. And they have to break out of that. It's part and parcel of advocacy to understand how campaigns are won. People want to believe that campaigns are won by the best person, the most pure person, or that person's personality. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of the times it's completely divorced from that.
Yeah.
So if you want to change policy, you have to understand how campaigns are run and get good at it.
Yes.
And that's actually how I started. I started as a lobbyist for Lenny Goldberg. For old timers who know Lenny Goldberg, he was this old time liberal, and he represented organizations, among other things, that advocated for tax increases in order to sustain funding for education and public services. So obviously, for 3.5 years, I would go lobby to increase taxes, and I would lose all the time. And I got
That's
tired
got to
of,
be a hell of a job.
yeah,
Bill.
it was horrible, but it was also, it was epic in so many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it also reminded me how important it was to elect the right people. So just going there and talking to the people that were already elected wasn't helpful. If you wanted to
Yeah.
change the math, you actually have to
Yes.
elect other people that
Yes.
can show
Yes.
that they can get elected on your issues.
Yes. No, you're totally right. It is a bit of a purity test, and it feels like that's dirty, right? Like I don't want to do contributions, and like I always say, listen, I didn't make this up. Bill Wong didn't create the game. It's just the game, and we're either going to let it happen without us, or we're going to participate in it. And it's to our benefit to make sure we get the right people elected, regardless of that.
And it can be done. I mean,
yeah.
in the 2018 cycle, 2020 cycle, Dawn Addis, who now is probably going to be the next assembly member from San Luis Obispo County, in 2020, she actually raised $218,000 in donations of $250 or less. So when we talk about how impossible it is for people to compete, she didn't win in 2020, but she came very close.
Yeah.
And now that she was able to close the deal in 2022 with a slightly different district. But
Yeah.
it just shows you that you can raise a competitive amount of money with small donors. You just have to invest the time and effort into it.
Very good point. And you also are illustrating that sometimes it takes more than one run to win, right? And that's normal, and that's actually okay. Same thing with legislation, by the way. You got to get several bites at the apple. So going back to viability, money is clearly a big deal, right? So I would say, look at how much money was raised last time to give you perspective, right? How much money generally, or I mean, assuming it's not an outlier and there wasn't some big thing happening, right? But like in general, how much has this district raised for these elections? Has that person raised any? One of the things that I used to look at when we were looking at candidates is if you have hustled for your money in your community and then you're coming to Sacramento asking for dollars versus, which has happened, I haven't raised a damn bit and I'm coming to Sacramento because I think everyone's just going to open their checkbook and start throwing money at me, which to me was an indicator, well, you're not serious then. You think this is an ATM. And I'll tell you one thing, a labor union is not an ATM. This is their members' dollars, right?
Right.
Maybe other groups are, but we took that very seriously. So I look at, for example, how much have you on your own raised, which to me is an indicator of how much community support you have. like you just said about Don Addis, who's advising you? Is that important?
Oh, totally important. I mean, it's not necessarily a game changer because you could have the best consultant, but if that consultant, if he or she has 30 races, the best consultant is not going to be able to give the best shot of trying to split up their time with 30 races. There's also cycles where one consultant's great and then the next cycle they suck. But
Mhm.
you have to have somebody who's had some experience, just the basic experience of running a campaign and doing it. So, yeah, I definitely do look at the experience and the track record of their consultants. I look at their local endorsements, and I
Mhm.
emphasize local endorsements.
Local,
There's a
yeah.
lot of candidates out there that get endorsements from legislators that are outside of their district.
Mm.
And I just think it's ridiculous. Is if you're running in the Central Valley and you've got like a Bay Area or a Los Angeles endorsement, like nobody cares. It doesn't
It might
really
actually work against
right?
you.
Exactly. So I look at their local endorsements. I
Yeah.
look at their operation. Do they have a solid campaign manager? Is their campaign manager come from labor, or is it just like my nephew or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because sometimes people see campaigns from the outside
Yeah.
and they think that they have this myth that it's just about your pluckiness that wins campaigns. You actually
Yeah.
have to have some very basic skills in order to be able to run a campaign.
Well, it goes back to organizing.
Right. So
Yeah.
all those types of infrastructure mechanics, I look at the fundamentals. I don't look at all the flashy stuff. Like some candidates, I've got the endorsement of AOC. It's like I don't care. Doesn't matter in this race.
To me, another indicator of seriousness and viability is how well that candidate knows their district and where they're going to get their voters from, right?
Hmm.
How many voters do they even need? Like those are just basic questions that to me, if a candidate doesn't know, they're not serious.
Hmm.
Like you got to know that district like the back of your hand. You need to know exactly which neighborhood your voters are coming for, how many of them there are, how many need to show up on election day. I learned that from people who've been around the block, and they learned from the people who are the masters. And I always took that so seriously. And I, again, would find lots of candidates who they didn't know what their win number was.
Yeah, I mean, those again, it's the fundamentals. And I think that there's a lot of people that get into politics and just think that it's again very like how many followers they have on Twitter or
Mm,
Facebook. And that's not it. You have to look at the hard metrics. Like how many yeses have you gotten on your phone calls?
yes.
How many yeses have you gotten on your door knocks? How many dollars are in your bank account? It comes down to just really hard, cruel math.
Yes. It does the same apply. So the same formula, or not formula, but would you say like you've done campaigns for state candidates? Does that all translate to federal, or is it really a different animal at that point?
There are nuances. I mean, in a lot of ways, some of the federals are a little bit easier because they do have certain lower contribution limits, and there's other factors that it's a little bit smaller footprint. But yeah, they're all basically the same fundamentals. They're
Mhm.
different rules and they're different dynamics. How we run
Yeah.
races on state legislative races is very different than how DCCC runs races on the federal level and where the priorities are and where the funding
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah. What do you say about the predictions that start? Like right now, we have a lot of post primary predictions, right? Who's strong? Who's looking like they got it wrapped up? And November is many
Mhm.
months away.
It's an eternity away, and I think that's the distraction. I think the toughest part of my job was always not be distracted by what
Mm,
people are saying on Twitter because
mm,
everybody on Twitter has got an agenda. Even like the newspapers have agendas because, for example,
yeah.
in San Francisco, they didn't even poll Asians in Asian languages. So for San Francisco, how do you not poll in Asian languages?
That's
So
okay.
right?
Yeah.
So
That's a
that was
problem.
yeah, that wasn't even
Yeah.
brought up as like, well, that maybe that was one reason why all of this talk about whether or not the election results showed an end to progressive
Oh,
criminal
right.
justice reform,
Right.
right? A lot of that was like a stretch I felt, and
Yes.
it is a concern. People are concerned about their safety, they are concerned about crime, but the real data out there shows a very mixed result. And
Yes.
none of these people really look at the mechanics of each loss is like how was their campaign run? The DA lost.
Right.
I don't know why they chose not to. I mean, they may have had a very good reason, but so many Chinese in San Francisco,
Yeah.
the very least you could have done was poll in Chinese to at least determine what your strategy was going to
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. But to draw a headline conclusion that all of a
Right.
sudden progressive San Francisco is giving the middle finger at criminal justice reform,
Right.
even though in Oakland and in Alameda, I believe that progressive DAs were elected in the same election cycle.
Correct.
Yeah. Months are eternity in political campaigns, right?
Yeah, and any polling that we do tomorrow is probably going to be irrelevant by the time you hit September or October because things change that quickly.
Are there people or organizations that you recommend advocates follow to really start understanding this better? Meaning like political pundits or news groups that get it right most of the time, or just analysis so that they can just sort of really start learning more.
I follow a lot of stuff, but I find that it's not all that helpful. It's more helpful to actually see what's on the ground, what kind of intel you're seeing locally. What a lot of people don't realize is that media world is constantly being bombarded with people who are trying to spin the perspective and manage expectations. So
Mhm.
a lot of it is going to be naturally off, and none of it is going to be deep enough to really get you a sense. And you should really focus more so locally or
Mhm.
in like a very specific race if you're interested in it
Yeah.
in order to know it better. There's so many things that just in the last 2 weeks that I've seen on
Mm.
social media and printed in papers that I thought was so wildly off the point and
Mm.
unsubstantiated with regard to their conclusions about what happened. There are people that were writing conclusions even before all the votes have
Mm.
finally
Right.
become in. I think when you see all that type of stuff, it's very hard to take any of that type of stuff seriously.
You just raised a great question. So there's that district in one of the border districts in Texas that just went Republican, predominant Latino district.
Mhm.
We're now, here's the headlines, right? Democrats are losing Latino voters. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm influenced by one headline. It does seem like there is some data behind where voters are going in the Latino community. And the fact that it's not a uniform monolith community, as any ethnic community is. What is your thoughts on that message?
Two thoughts. I mean, I think that go to the Latino Vote. That's a podcast by Mike Madrid and Chuck Rocha. They've got a phenomenally entertaining take on it. They're dead on with regard to the nuances about what should be taken from it. My fear, though, is like when you see stuff like this, similar to the criminal justice reform, everybody is trying to apply their interpretation of it. And I think ultimately, if you really kind of are honest with yourself, you really know where we're off message on stuff and where we've completely come off the rails, whether you're Republican or Democrat, with regard to our outreach to voters. And that's a part of the direction that kind of spurred my retirement was that there's politics and then there's the business of politics.
Mm,
So now, just because there's a spin on a certain race or in a certain strategy, that doesn't mean that it's the best strategy. It could just be meaning that people are just trying to make some money. And that's completely nonpartisan that's out there. Like I
yeah.
see a lot of strategy, a lot of wasted money on stuff that
Yes.
is just basically paying for somebody's vacation home or
Yeah. Oh,
whatever. I think there are a lot of great consultants out there, but I also see a lot of fat and inefficiencies that are
oh,
just driven by business
yes.
decisions. Like
Yes.
somebody just wanted to spend a lot of money, and then the consultant said, "Well, if you want me to spend it, I can't win this race, but if you want me to spend it, I'll spend it." So
Right.
that's why you see a lot of stuff that's out there. And then when it doesn't work, they try to explain why it didn't work in a way that fits their narrative as opposed
Mm,
to what the truth is. So
yeah.
I think that a lot of times there is really not a good business model to really get good Latino polling out there because everything is designed to use existing methods. It's expensive because you have to get like Spanish speakers, you have to get Chinese speakers. That cuts my bottom line. So financial incentive to
Mm,
not do those types of things
yeah.
because you get paid whether you win or lose a race. I mean, it hurts your reputation if you lose a race, but
Yeah.
ultimately everybody gets paid. So I mean, there's a problem in the sense that
There's a problem. That
you
seems
know,
really
right?
backward to me. Yeah.
So I mean, there are reasons why
Mm,
things aren't done correctly or why we miss nuances. I'm not saying everybody's doing it, but I think that there are influences to
yeah.
running really horrible campaigns
Yeah.
and then an effort to explain them away as, oh, yeah, we did reach out to Latinos or we did reach out to Chinese, but they're just like bad turnout or like whatever. I think that
Yeah.
the great thing about Mike and Chuck's podcast is like they're brutally honest about failings on both sides of the aisle and their hearts are in it with regard to really saying, hey, in the end, Latino communities are not being served by quote unquote the establishment.
Where do people find you, Bill, if they want to get in touch?
They can find me on Twitter. I post a lot of pandas and puppies, and occasionally I will make comment about political campaigns and such. And my handle is Bill Wong LLC
You
on
are
Twitter.
a fun Twitter follow. I can testify to that. Any parting words of wisdom?
get out there and organize. I mean, it's not pretty. It's like getting your hands dirty. It's like you're shaping the clay by yourself. It's like, don't let somebody else do the work for you.
Yeah.
And please, please, please get away from all that performative type of stuff. The conversations you have at somebody's door are way better than the conversations you have on Twitter. Like they say, people on social media don't vote, people on Social Security do. So,
Mm,
get out there, talk to real people,
yeah.
and really understand where they're coming from.
I like that. Thank you, Bill. And thank you for sharing your day with me. And this has been super valuable. And I learned a lot listening to you. So thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me on.